Over the decades, the deaths of Kevin Ives and Don Henry have spawned investigations, accusations, and a legacy of unanswered questions. Their story has become a case study in forensic failure, alleged political cover-ups, and what can happen when justice runs into power. What exactly happened on those tracks that night remains a mystery, but not for lack of clues. Welcome to Bad Things. Join us as we examine the case of the boys on the tracks. What we know, what's been said, and what most likely happened. Before we get into today's video, we are very excited to announce our first giveaway to thank you, our loyal viewers of the wild true crime world. We are giving away $200 cash this month, thanks to our partners over at the Recco social app. If you've ever watched videos on YouTube, TikTok or Instagram and thought, where do people even find that cool tech, trendy fashion, gear, those gadgets? It's usually impossible to track down. Most of what you see online isn't linked anywhere. That's why we partnered with Recco. It's a new app that makes videos instantly shoppable. You can tap products directly inside videos and see exactly where to get them. No searching, no guessing, just instant access. All you have to do is download Recco using the link in the description, and you'll automatically be entered to win $200 cash. The winner will be announced next month. Good luck, and let's get back to the video. Timeline. On the night of August 22nd, 1987, Kevin Ives and Don Henry, two high school friends from Bryant, Arkansas, told Don's father they were going spotlighting, hunting in the woods behind Don's house near a stretch of railroad tracks. They took a flashlight and Don's .22 rifle. It was a familiar activity in a familiar place. By 4:25 a.m. the next morning, a Union Pacific freight train traveling through Saline County approached a bend near Bryant Hill. Engineer Stephen Schroyer saw two bodies lying parallel on the tracks, arms at their sides with a rifle beside them. He hit the brakes and sounded the horn, but the train couldn't stop in time. The crew reported seeing a green tarp partially covering the boys. Deputies arrived minutes later. The scene was gruesome. Kevin and Don's bodies had been mutilated by the train. The shattered rifle was recovered, but no tarp was found, and police claimed they were never told one existed. Authorities initially labeled the deaths an accident or possible suicide, attributing them to marijuana use. Dr. Fahmy Malak, the state medical examiner, ruled that the boys had smoked 20 marijuana joints and passed out on the tracks. The families rejected this, and independent toxicologists later confirmed Malak's findings were medically implausible. Dr. Joseph Burton, an out-of-state examiner, performed second autopsies and found clear signs of foul play. Kevin had a blunt force head injury. Don had been stabbed in the back. The state changed the cause of death from accidental to undetermined, and a grand jury later ruled it a double homicide. Investigators zeroed in on the missing tarp, the unexplained injuries, and suspicious activity near the tracks. A man in military fatigues had reportedly been seen in the area days before and on the night of the deaths. Witnesses who came forward with information began dying under mysterious circumstances. Some were shot, stabbed, or disappeared entirely. In 1997, Dan Harmon, the prosecutor who had once helped reopen the case, was convicted of running a drug ring out of the same office. Years later, Kevin's mother, Linda Ives, sued multiple federal agencies, alleging a cover-up. In 2018, a former wrestler, Billy Jack Haynes, claimed to have witnessed the murders during a drug drop, but provided no physical evidence. Despite multiple investigations, shifting autopsy results, and dozens of leads, no one has ever been charged. The case remains officially unsolved. Theories. More than 3 decades after Kevin Ives and Don Henry were killed, the case remains unsolved, but not for lack of theories. Over the years, multiple explanations have emerged, shaped by medical findings, witness testimony, and political fallout. Some are grounded in investigative work, others grew from speculation and frustration. Below are the major theories that attempt to answer the same question. What happened to Kevin and Don on the tracks that night, and why? Number 1. A drug-induced accident. This was the first, and for a time the only official explanation, that Kevin and Don died in a drug-related accident with no foul play involved. According to this theory, the boys smoked an unusually large quantity of marijuana that night, perhaps as much as 20 joints, and either passed out on the tracks or deliberately lay down while too intoxicated to appreciate the danger. The train that struck them then was simply an instrument of tragic timing. Supporters of this view have pointed to the initial lack of blood at the scene and the absence of clear signs of a struggle, at least as reported in early police files. Some argued that the boys may have engaged in reckless behavior, such as lying on the tracks as a joke or prank, not realizing the imminent risk. But this version of events has come under sustained attack. Later toxicology reports contradicted the massive THC levels initially claimed, and forensic pathologists found injuries inconsistent with an accident. Indications that both boys may have been incapacitated or dead before the train ever arrived. Even so, some defenders of the theory insist that the medical evidence is more ambiguous than critics claim. You can't build a murder case out of anomalies, one retired officer argued in a 2003 radio interview. You need direct evidence of intent or identity. You don't have that here. Ultimately, the accident theory remains foundational, not because it's credible, but because it was the first filter through which the case was viewed. And whether due to bureaucratic inertia, flawed science, or something more deliberate, it cast a long shadow over every subsequent theory. Number 2. Witnesses to a drug operation. This theory, now considered the prevailing hypothesis among journalists and many former officials, holds that Kevin and Don stumbled upon a drug-related operation taking place near the tracks that night. Perhaps a drop, a transaction, or a mobile lab. According to this account, the boys inadvertently witnessed something incriminating and were killed to ensure their silence. The motive is simple: self-preservation. The location, remote, unlit, and accessible from multiple directions, would have been ideal for criminal activity under the radar, and the boys, out hunting with a flashlight and a rifle, could have been mistaken for a threat. While the theory has the benefit of explaining several inconsistencies in the early investigation, such as the missing tarp, the missing time, and the effort to declare the deaths accidental, it's not without problems. Some skeptics argue that it relies too heavily on circumstantial reasoning. The idea that they just happened to interrupt a drug deal at exactly the wrong moment. It's possible, said one state investigator anonymously, but you have to believe they were extraordinarily unlucky, or that someone was already watching them. Variants of this theory diverge on who the perpetrators were. In some versions, the killers were local criminals with no official connections. In others, they were corrupt law enforcement officers themselves, on duty perhaps, and using their authority to carry out drug-related activity under the radar. But while the details remain debated, this explanation has become the most widely circulated theory. So much so that it was openly proposed on national television less than a year after the boys died. Still, its very popularity has led some to question whether it's a red herring in its own right. A convenient narrative for those eager to assign motive without having to identify specific suspects. Number 3. A botched law enforcement encounter. This theory posits a different kind of explanation, one that doesn't necessarily involve premeditated murder or organized crime. According to this scenario, the boys may have been confronted by law enforcement or a private security force patrolling the area. A misunderstanding, confrontation, or overreaction led to one or both of the boys being injured, perhaps fatally. Realizing the magnitude of what had happened, the responsible party then staged the scene on the tracks to cover up the incident. This version attempts to account for the staging of the bodies, the presence of Don's own rifle, and the apparent neatness of how they were laid across the rails. It also offers a reason why early police response seemed disinterested in further investigation. Perhaps the first responders knew more than they said. If it was an accidental shooting, one former local official speculated in an off-record conversation, you'd have every reason to make it disappear. Importantly, this theory doesn't require the presence of a drug operation or a larger criminal conspiracy. It suggests instead a tragic miscalculation by someone in uniform, followed by a rush to cover one's tracks, literally and figuratively. But it still faces major challenges. There's no hard evidence that any officer reported a confrontation with the boys, and no known confessions or whistleblowers have stepped forward to support it. For some, that silence is proof enough. For others, it's just more smoke with no fire. Number 4. Federal-level conspiracy. This theory stretches beyond local corruption into the realm of geopolitical intrigue. According to those who believe it, the boys weren't just witnesses to a random criminal act. They were caught up in a much larger federal-protected drug trafficking operation connected to Barry Seal, Mena Airport, and the CIA's alleged Iran-Contra-era activities in Arkansas. The implication is that the location near Bryant Hill was not a one-off drug site, but part of a statewide network involving airdrops and distribution channels used to fund covert operations abroad. In this theory, Kevin and Don saw more than just a backwoods transaction. They witnessed a federal-sanctioned event that had to be covered up by any means necessary. Advocates point to the extensive resistance Kevin's mother, Linda Ives, faced when trying to access federal files, stonewalled by multiple agencies, including the DEA and DHS, as evidence that national-level secrets were involved. "This isn't about two boys on a railroad track," said one independent investigator in the mid-1990s. "This is about what the US government didn't want anyone in Arkansas to see." The theory was popularized by documentaries like the Clinton Chronicles, which suggested then-Governor Bill Clinton may have been aware of, or even protected, these drug operations for political reasons. Though no direct evidence ever surfaced connecting Clinton to the case, the circumstantial overlap between local drug rings, political appointments, and the Mena scandal has kept the theory alive. However, critics are quick to point out that no federal agent or whistleblower has ever corroborated this theory with evidence. The most detailed information still comes from public speculation, circumstantial lawsuits, and anonymous sources. As one skeptic put it, if the CIA really did kill two high school boys in Arkansas, wouldn't someone in 30 years have talked? Even Linda Ives, while skeptical of federal silence, never named specific federal agents or pointed to a particular operation. Her lawsuit focused more on lack of transparency than accusation. Nonetheless, for a certain segment of the public, the federal theory remains compelling. If not for its evidence, then for its symbolic power. It turns the case into something bigger than itself. Number 5. A targeted personal attack. Though rarely discussed in depth, one theory holds that Kevin and Don were victims of a personal vendetta, possibly tied to an incident no one has ever uncovered. Under this view, their deaths were not about what they witnessed, but who they were, perhaps involving a jealous peer, a spurned acquaintance, or even an adult with a grudge. The crime in this scenario may have been premeditated or spontaneous, but the motive would have been deeply personal. The main challenge for this theory is the total lack of supporting evidence. Neither boy was known to have enemies, and no friend, classmate, or neighbor ever came forward with stories of threats, conflict, or unusual behavior. Still, a few proponents argue that the absence of known motive is not proof that none existed. Sometimes these cases are personal, not political, said a private investigator consulted in the 1990s. And the deeper you look for conspiracies, the more you miss what's right in front of you. This theory struggles to explain the layers of obstruction and intimidation that followed the deaths. Witnesses killed, documents withheld, investigations derailed. Could a lone killer really generate that level of systemic interference? Most find that unlikely. But it's worth noting that several unsolved murders in Saline County during the same time period had no obvious drug ties, raising the possibility that other violent actors were also operating in the area. Number 6. Fabrication or false confession. In 2018, retired pro wrestler Billy Jack Haynes released a recorded confession claiming to have been present when Kevin and Don were killed. He stated he had been hired to provide security for a drug drop, witnessed the murders, and helped move the bodies onto the tracks. In his telling, the teens were assaulted for getting too close to the operation. Kevin struck with a rifle, Don stabbed, and the whole thing was caught on videotape. If Haynes' account is accurate, it would resolve much of the mystery. But law enforcement has never verified his story, and no physical evidence has been produced to support it. Haynes also suffers from documented neurological issues stemming from repeated head trauma and has served time for unrelated offenses, raising serious concerns about his credibility. Some believe Haynes may have inserted himself into the story for attention or in a delusional bid for significance. Others argue that even if his recollection is flawed, it may contain fragments of truth. What he said matches the injuries. That's hard to ignore, said R. David Lewis, an attorney for the Ives family. But even Lewis acknowledged that without corroboration, the confession could be meaningless. Ultimately, this theory occupies a strange space between confirmation and distraction. It aligns with forensic facts and echoes earlier suspicions, but without names, evidence, or a known motive for Haynes to come forward decades later, it remains more anecdote than resolution. Each theory offers a different explanation for how Kevin and Don ended up on those tracks, some pointing to accidents, others to calculated murder. But they all share one underlying belief. This was no coincidence. Whether the boys were witnesses, targets, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, something happened that someone wanted to keep hidden. The question isn't whether foul play occurred, it's who was behind it and how far the cover-up went. One of these theories fits the facts better than the rest. Next, we examine what most likely happened. What most likely happened. The death of Kevin Ives and Don Henry is not unsolved because there are no clues. It remains unresolved because the clearest explanation has always implicated people with something to lose. For decades, public attention has bounced between local misconduct, federal secrecy, and political intrigue. But when the theories are stripped down to their essentials, method, motive, means, and aftermath, only one holds together under scrutiny. The most plausible scenario is this. Kevin and Don walked into an active drug operation. The men involved, fearing exposure, killed them and staged their bodies on the tracks. The perpetrators were not international operatives or rogue agents, but local actors with enough influence to obstruct the initial investigation. That influence, rooted in criminal enterprise and enabled by official indifference, allowed the truth to stay buried. There's no need for coded cover stories or speculative connections to distant airports. Everything that needed to happen took place within a few square miles of Saline County, Arkansas. An opportunity the boys didn't know they were walking into. What put Kevin and Don in the crosshairs was neither rebellion nor recklessness. It was routine. They were doing something they had done before, hunting in the woods behind Don's house, along a stretch of track they knew by memory. They had a flashlight, a rifle, and nothing else. No indication they were looking for trouble, No suggestion they were anticipating danger. But that wooded corridor, bordered by open fields and accessible by dirt roads, had qualities that made it attractive not just to night hunters, but to smugglers. Arkansas in the 1980s had become a well-traveled route in the Southeast's narcotics pipeline. Rural stretches of land with minimal lighting, irregular patrols, and proximity to flight paths were often used for covert airdrops and backwoods pickups. The method was simple. A small plane flew low at night and dropped cargo to the ground where men were already waiting. Such operations required a precise location, brief window, and no witnesses. There's no direct proof that such a drop was planned near Bryant Hill on August 23, 1987, but there is circumstantial evidence it's exactly what happened. Multiple witnesses later described hearing planes overhead on nights surrounding the boys' deaths. Prosecutor Richard Garrett publicly stated on national television that the teens saw something they shouldn't have, and it had to do with drugs. And a Saline County grand jury investigating the case formally cited drug trafficking as a possible motive behind their deaths. If Kevin and Don had been in the area, their flashlight beam or presence alone may have been enough to disrupt the operation. Whether they saw a drop, men with equipment, or vehicles waiting nearby is unknown, but they were close enough to threaten the secrecy of the event. That alone could have triggered a lethal response. A crime of convenience, concealment, and corruption. Once the decision to neutralize the boys was made, the execution was quick. The autopsy findings offer clues. Kevin's skull had been crushed, consistent with blunt force trauma, possibly delivered from behind, while Don had a stab wound to the back. Both injuries were sustained before the train arrived, and neither showed signs of typical defensive wounds. This implies the boys were taken by surprise, subdued immediately, and either killed or rendered unconscious. What followed was a calculated attempt to erase the murder. The railroad tracks provided a brutal method of disposal. A train would not only destroy forensic evidence, but also create a plausible cover story, particularly if the boys could be made to appear as if they'd been lying there voluntarily. That staging is exactly what the train crew observed. Two bodies lying in near-perfect parallel, arms by their sides, with a rifle resting nearby. Engineer Stephen Schroyer would later call the layout too perfect to be natural. What complicated that illusion was the green tarp seen by all four train crew members. None of the boys owned such an item. Its presence indicates planning. Covering the bodies may have been intended to obscure them from the train's view until it was too late, or to mask the visual of blood or injury from anyone who arrived on the scene first. The tarp's disappearance remains one of the case's most telling anomalies. Law enforcement claimed it was never there. The engineer insisted it was. In later statements, prosecutor Garrett confirmed all four witnesses described it in detail. That discrepancy cannot be dismissed as confusion. Something, or someone, removed the tarp before the scene was processed. Whether it was taken by one of the perpetrators returning to eliminate incriminating evidence, or quietly discarded by a responding officer who recognized its implications, the result was the same. A key piece of physical proof vanished. That kind of interference doesn't happen by accident. Who had access, authority, and a reason to obstruct? A drug ring operating in rural Arkansas would have needed two things to survive: discretion and protection. The second was arguably more important than the first. If local authorities were willing to look the other way, or worse, participate, the risk of exposure dropped dramatically. In the months after the deaths, the reaction of Saline County officials was not aggressive investigation, but immediate deflection. Sheriff Jim Steed told reporters there was nothing suspicious about the scene. He refused to pursue leads that pointed to homicide. He claimed to have submitted the boys' clothing to the FBI, when in reality it went to the state lab, which lacked the proper tools for advanced analysis. Meanwhile, Dr. Fahmy Malak, the state medical examiner, offered an autopsy conclusion so scientifically implausible that it became the subject of national ridicule. Marijuana, he said, had rendered the boys unconscious. He suggested they passed out from cannabis alone, a theory rejected by every independent toxicologist who reviewed the case. But Malak did not revise his findings. He stood by them until political pressure forced a second opinion, which reversed his conclusions. The question that remains is why such clearly flawed conclusions were ever offered. One answer is that the real suspects couldn't be pursued. Investigators like Gene Duffy, who led a regional drug task force, later said their work was deliberately suppressed when they began tracking links between drug distribution networks and individuals in public office. As soon as we got close, she said in a sworn affidavit, my task force was dismantled. Dan Harmon, who had initially supported the family's fight for justice, would later be convicted of running a drug operation from within the prosecutor's office. His position had given him the power to shape the investigation and the incentive to misdirect it. If Harmon was in league with the very people the boys encountered, his involvement explains the smoke and mirrors that followed. Friendly media quotes, limited scope investigations, and the silencing of potential witnesses. A pattern of elimination. One of the most disturbing patterns in the case is the number of individuals connected to the incident who later died under suspicious circumstances. These were not accidental deaths. They were stabbings, shootings, burnings, and disappearances. Many of them had been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury or were known to have made statements about what happened that night. Among them, Kevin Coney, killed in a motorcycle crash with slash wounds to his neck. Kevin McCaskill, stabbed to death days after warning friends he was next. Greg Collins, shot multiple times before he could testify. Jeff Rhodes, found burned and shot in a dumpster after telling family he feared for his life. David Bearden, who vanished without a trace. These are not coincidences, they are outcomes. The effort to contain the truth did not stop at misdirection, it extended into outright elimination of threats. In March 1990, a New County grand jury declared these deaths homicides likely tied to the Ives Henry case. No arrests followed. Why the other theories collapse? The original accidental death theory, once dominant, is no longer viable. Forensic science debunked it. Credible experts exposed its flaws. Even state officials abandoned it. The law enforcement mishap theory offers a less sinister view, but it cannot explain the pattern of witness deaths or the removal of the tarp. An accidental killing does not usually require multiple follow-up murders. The idea that Kevin and Don were targeted for personal reasons lacks both motive and evidence. Neither boy had known enemies, and there were no signs of an altercation. The federal conspiracy theory, while attention-grabbing, depends on assumptions unsupported by direct evidence. Despite years of lawsuits and investigations, no federal agent has been identified or charged, and no classified document has been released to confirm CIA involvement. Even Linda Ives, who sued the government for records, focused more on obstruction than on naming perpetrators. As for Billy Jack Haynes' confession, its forensic accuracy is intriguing, but its reliability is undermined by his personal circumstances and lack of proof. His claims align with the dominant theory, but add little in terms of actionable evidence. The simplest explanation that fits all the facts. Kevin and Don encountered an ongoing drug operation. They were not participants, not rebels, not conspirators. They were teenagers doing something familiar in the wrong place at the wrong time. The men running the operation decided they couldn't afford to let the boys leave. They killed them quickly, then placed their bodies on the tracks, using the train as a tool of concealment, not cause. The presence of the tarp, the positioning of the bodies, and the quietness of the scene all suggest deliberate staging. The immediate dismissal of foul play, the failure to preserve evidence, and the misleading autopsy suggest deliberate obstruction. Those responsible had connections. They had authority. And when the case threatened to expose them, they used both to maintain control. That web, part criminal, part official, held long enough to keep charges from ever being filed. In the end, the theory that most clearly aligns with motive, method, means, and cover-up is also the most direct. Kevin and Don were murdered by people involved in drug trafficking in Saline County. Their deaths were staged to look accidental. The truth was buried by those who had the power to bury it. As Linda Ives said, they would like for you to think that this case is just old and complicated and there isn't any way to solve it. But that's not true. This case is solvable. The pieces are not missing. They were just deliberately scattered. Do you want to bring bad things with you wherever you go? Our episodes are now available as a podcast. Look us up on your favorite podcast app and listen to the most truth-seeking true crime podcast out there. Timeline.